today I want to talk about, I kind of started going that way last week, and then I realized I couldn't go any further unless I addressed this. We read in the New Testament alone, I believe it's over 70 times, the word or concept of judgment, a judgment that will come. And I want to talk about this because I realize that people who have been in the church, who've studied here for a long time, they may have some insight and from previous teachings, but there are a lot of people out there that get this confused, and I see this many times with what people are discussing, whether it's in a question format or in forums where it's just like, no, we need to clear this up. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the judgment seat of Christ today, and to distinguish between the judgment seat of Christ and the white throne judgment. So first, let's just talk about these two things. At the judgment seat of Christ, which we read about in 2 Corinthians 5 and in Romans 14, there are other places where it is alluded to, but those are the two passages specifically where it mentions this. It is important to understand what this means. The judgment seat of Christ is a place where believers will be judged. The white throne judgment will be where non-believers are judged. But let me talk about this because this is where confusion sets in. The judgment seat of Christ will not be a place. It is not where sin is dealt with. Sin and salvation are not the topic there. For anyone who has trusted Christ and has believed, has faithed in him, sin and salvation has already been dealt with. Now, I want to leave that statement for a minute because there'll be people that are going to get confused and say, are you preaching once saved, always saved? And I'm not. But let me come back to that. So the judgment seat of Christ is where believers will stand. It says we will all stand and give account. And this is what I want to talk about today. Perhaps in another message, I will talk about the white throne judgment because that pertains to non-believers. But why this is important is because I often think Christians in general, either they forget or they are not taught. This is something that we should be mindful of, that should be on our mind a lot. This is why Romans 14, Paul starts down the pathway of saying, why do you judge your brother? Why do you hold your brother at naught? And he goes on there to talk about, don't be preoccupied with judging your fellow man or fellow woman. And this happened everywhere, not just to those recipients of the Romans letter, but it happened literally anywhere that the gospel was preached. In the early days where you had a vast majority of early converts being Jews. And I want you to imagine the confusion. If your whole life you were taught to adhere to the ceremonial laws, the laws that pertain to your daily living, the way you eat, the way you worship, if that's how you were born and raised, and if you weren't hearing the gospel from the Apostle Paul, say you were hearing it from somebody else with less understanding, you might end up thinking that what this new faith is Christ plus Judaism equals thus and so. And this is what was happening in a lot of places. So you had people who, this is why he talks about why do you judge one, what one eats or what one doesn't eat. He says this several times, Romans, Galatians, over and over again, because we could definitely understand that some of the converts, those that had maybe kept the ceremonial law their whole life, which is to not eat any unclean thing. Now here are believers commingled who are eating things that in their previous commitment, in their previous understanding, they were not to eat. They were viewed as unclean. But we know from the New Testament, even Peter was reluctant to eat certain things, and the voice that speaks to him says, all things are clean. You can eat it all. It's all clean. So it's important for us to understand there would have been people judging each other that would bring about spiritual pride. Well, I don't eat that, and look at that guy over there. He's eating that, and look at that woman over there. She either has her head uncovered or it's covered. So you can see there would be a lot of confusion in the early church. And what Paul was dealing with in Romans 14 specifically there is essentially saying not what Jesus was saying in Matthew 7. In Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Judge not." Don't judge, because the same measuring stick with which you judge somebody, that's how you will be judged. That's not what's being said by Paul in Romans 14. What he's saying is essentially, you are treading on something that belongs to Christ when you begin to judge a brother. Only one will have a say. Now, we can flap our jaws, and by the way, Paul was dealing with this in his day. We still are dealing with this today because people, Christian people, do something strange when they read the Bible. It either doesn't apply to them, or it's something that was instructions just for those people, but not for us. But the fact of the matter is, the fact that the Apostle Paul had to address this, tells you that there was something of a problem, because if you look in most of the writings, of his writings, it's a problem. And what he's saying there in Romans 14 is, you are essentially treading on the office of Christ. Don't you know we will all stand and give account? So the minute you start judging another, whether it's that person in weakness that is uncertain about what they should eat, whether they're allowed to eat or drink, or whether you start judging somebody because they're taking liberties with certain things. But this is why Paul says elsewhere, I believe it's in Colossians, when he says, whatever you do, do it unto the Lord. You're not doing it to your fellow man in this particular way. You're doing it unto the Lord. So there are two concepts that have to be understood. This judgment seat of Christ, there is only one judge. And that one judge has been given full authority. Now, what will we be judged on? And what will we give account on? And here is one of the most challenging messages, because I'm sure people will hear what I'm saying, and because it's so difficult to explain in crystal clear form, there will be people who will think, well, maybe she's talking about works. So let me be clear from the beginning. There is no work that you will ever do that will save you. There are people out there that think if they go and do enough good deeds, if they save enough animals and walk elderly people across the crosswalk, or whatever it is that you think is a good deed, that enough of those will get you in. But if you have that mindset, you're basically saying the sacrifice of Christ counts for nothing. He paid it all. Now, distinguish between, and I've said this before, it took me a long time to crystallize this for me. I had to look at somebody else's writing and understanding to really grab hold of this. And it's a concept that most people get wrong. I'm sorry to say it like this. Martin Luther understood and said it very succinctly. Good works will come. Good works come through the believer after the person they've trusted Christ, they are now saved, they are in Him, they're trusting Him. The Holy Spirit has come, and as I was speaking last week about the Greek word arabon, which is a deposit, like the coat check ticket, until you're ready to turn the whole thing in, where you get back your coat in exchange for the ticket, right? So here we have a clear concept. The important part of this is that good works will flow from the inside out of the believer. And they are not me thinking, I will go and do, because this will count for something on the scale to equalize my bad and my negative. It doesn't work like that. Otherwise, you're just talking about a pagan mindset of Janus weighing the scales, the version of justice, if you will. So good works will come, but they are the expression of God flowing through the believer, not the believer saying, I will go, I'm going to do this. This is something that I'm going to tell you the vast majority of Christian people I have spoken with, not over the course of 15 years, but over the course of 25, think that still getting out there and doing works that they want to do, good works. I'm not saying that doing a good deed is bad, but they have a Jamesian mindset after reading James, which is where most of the church world starts, to go out and do, because the mindset is, well, faith without works. But there is a missing piece right there. So this judgment seat, where we will all stand and give account, each one for him or herself. Let me first say this, and this is why I address my Catholic listeners. For God's sake, this is not something to be mean or to be cruel. You are going to stand before your Maker without your priest, without your pastor, without your minister, without your deacon, without your elder, without your husband, without your wife, without your children, without your pets. You will stand alone, and you alone will give account. Do you understand that? Because why I'm saying that may be a jaw-dropping shock to some people that say, well, it should translate into here and now you have one mediator, Jesus Christ. No man, no woman. I'm sorry, it is not biblical. There is no biblical justification for anything but your personal relationship with Jesus Christ, not with Mary, not with the apostles, not with anybody else in the Bible. Your relationship with God himself. That's it, because you will stand by yourself before God. And I pity the person who, after I've just said this, says, I've gone to confession my whole life. I've looked to my pastor. I've looked to my priest. Well, friend, this is what I've been saying for 15 years. My calling is to get you to build your relationship with God, to understand his word and what he wants of you. Top of the list, he wants you to trust him and take him at his word. So, the important thing is to understand no one is going to be representing you there. So what exactly happens if my sin is not dealt with there? The Bible says that at the moment that I first believed, that was dealt with. The moment I first trusted Christ, my sin and salvation have been dealt with. In the Bible, if you want to go old or new, in the Old Testament, Psalm 103 says that my sins have been removed as far as the east is from the west. And that's his doing. He took it upon himself. You want it from Isaiah. The Lord laid upon him the iniquity of us all paid for. You want it from the New Testament? It can keep going. The point is that's not what's being dealt with. So what is being dealt with? What will we be looking at, or what will we be talking about or discussing? And really, it won't be a discussion. It will be essentially everything that your whole life represents from the time you came to the faith until the time you left this earth. This is why there are parables in this Bible. For example, the 1-talent man and the 10-talent man, they will stand and they will give account separately, but they will give account of their stewardship. This is what, you remember in that passage when it says, give account of thy stewardship? That's what's going to be addressed there. The wise and the foolish of those virgins, that will be addressed there. The sheep and the goat, the wheat and the tares. Now, when I say that, again, I'm using concepts. As I said, this is not a place to judge sin and salvation. It's a place to judge what you did, essentially, with the information that you received. And I know how difficult this is to hear, because there's something in our mind that goes, ooh, I coil back from that. But it's time for us to take a little reality check. You know, I could sit here today and try and make this as palatable as possible, sugarcoat it so that people are not going, oh my God. And I'll give you a perfect case in point so you can understand what a sensitive soul, what's going to be going through the sensitive soul's mind. I would speak for me first, and I'd say, what will be looked at when I stand before him? And it's not just pastors and teachers. It'll be everyone, all each person. But I have to ask myself constantly, why am I doing what I'm doing? I ask myself that on a regular basis. Not because I'm confused, but I want to make sure that there is no root of pride in what I'm doing, that there is no ulterior motive. And each time I ask myself the question, the same answer comes back. I have a burden for people who are lost, who maybe don't even know they're lost. I have a burden for people who ultimately, at the end of their journey, might say, why did somebody not tell me? Why didn't somebody tell me the truth? So I realize that I am the person, and there are other people like me, few, but there are other people like me who will just put the truth out there, regardless of how popular or how embraced or how appreciated or how despised it is. But this judgment seat will be an account of your stewardship. So I want you to think of certain words that will be reoccurring themes for this judgment seat of Christ. One of them is rewards. You know how many times you read the Bible, especially in the New Testament, but there are Old Testament references about rewards for the faithful, rewards to the believer. Hebrews 11, he that cometh to him must believe that he is God and that he is the rewarder of those that diligently seek him. You read in other places like Matthew 6 where it says, when you do your alms, when you give money, when you give of your time, when you do anything, you do it in secret. Why? So your heavenly Father can reward you. He sees in secret, he will reward you openly. Now, let's take that statement, reward you openly. People have fought over this. What does this mean? The openly means just that. When you are standing before him, he will reward you openly, right then and there. It will be either, and it won't be, don't think, enter in, well done, good and faithful servant, as opposed to depart from me, I never knew you. Because we're dealing with the subject of what you did with what you received. Which is why Jesus' method of teaching, his parabolic method, teaching in parables, is so vitally important for us to understand this. If we are merely reading the Bible like it's a good story, but we're not absorbing and taking in the precepts that are in this book, you know the expression, there'll be a test afterwards? There'll be a test afterwards. Now, this message might scare a lot of people, but I don't want it to be that in the course of my lifetime, in the course of the opportunities I had, that I didn't tell you. I want it to be clear from my conscience. And you might say, wow, this is a pretty serious message here, but it is. You see, because a lot of people think this judgment seat pertains to somebody else. But let me show you in two places. I will start first in the passage that I was previously looking at in 2 Corinthians 5. And if you remember, in 2 Corinthians 5, I was talking last week about this, hath given us the earnest of the Spirit. That's where we were looking last week. Therefore, we are always confident, knowing that, verse 6, whilst we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Wherefore we labor that, whether present or absent, we may be accepted of him. And here is my verse. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. And I taught on this word bad, by the way. I have notes here in my Bible on this, which I will deal with at another time. But my point is, why is he saying this? He speaks about having the earnest of the Spirit, and then goes on to say, and we shall all, we must all, not we if you feel like it. When there's a word must, pay attention, because that usually is an imperative in the Greek, which basically says, you got no choice, friend. That's where you and I are going to stand. If you read it from Romans 14, Romans 14 is exactly what I was describing about judging one another. He says, whether we eat, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not. Let him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. This is another area where people tend to really booger this up big time. It's not your business to be my fruit inspector, and it's not mine to be yours. You work out your salvation. It's between you and God. Now, having said that, how many in this room, show of hands, know someone that sits in judgment of you, whether it's your faith, what you do, how you live your life? Yeah, okay, that's almost all the room, almost. So just keep in mind one thing. Not only does Jesus say, don't judge. Interesting, though, that Paul says, essentially, who art thou that thou judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Read down there, getting by verse 10, when he says, but why dost thou judge thy brother, or why dost thou set it not thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And here we've got a kind of, I'd call it a muddled quotation from Isaiah. As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall confess to God. So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. Now you've got this in two places. So we need to understand a few things. Out of Romans, that passage is clearly saying, do not tread on the job of the judge. And this is hard for human nature because that is our nature. Our nature is we are born experts on everything, not born to criticize, born to comment, born to tell other people what they are not doing right, which is why Jesus said, before you start talking, friend, first book of Scott here, you might want to look at your own issues, the beam and the mote. So out of 2 Corinthians, we have something else. So don't think they're being addressed the same way. Out of Romans, he's saying, there's one judge, don't tread on his work. Here, we are essentially being given some comfort that God has given us the deposit. In fact, if you go back to the previous 4th chapter where it talks about all the diverse things that may befall the believer, yet God has placed this deposit in us, which is the comfort by which we can say, we're going to make it through, we're going to make it all the way through until the end. Now, we will stand and give account. I think for the Corinthians, they had a lot of behavioral issues that were grafted on, either from paganistic traditions or those that had become Christians but brought in their own version of traditions. So the instructions here basically are letting us know, for the Corinthians specifically, you're going to stand, but it's going to apply to all of us. All are going to stand. But remember, these are the people that kicked around the Spirit as if it was a light switch. You could flip it on and off. These are people that had blatant disregard for order in the church. So there's a lot of issues. But the one that really needs to be highlighted is what exactly then, first let's say for the Corinthians, what would it mean for those to stand and give account? Well, they came to the faith, and now what did they do with their stewardship? A lot of people think, for example, that giving money, which I don't talk about a lot, but giving money should never be talked about in the church because it's something that only corrupt people do. No, friends. And anybody who thinks that has not spent any time reading the 66 books of the Bible, because giving is intrinsic to Christianity. In fact, it's inescapable both in Judaism, done in a different way, and within Christianity. So important is it that when Jesus is talking about in Matthew 6, giving, fasting, prayer, he says, all these things, don't make them into a spectacle. Don't make them into a show. You do them. It is essentially your stewardship. Don't make a show out of it. Your Heavenly Father will reward you accordingly. And many times over, in fact, I had to write these down because you know me, I'm not a Proverbs person. Proverbs 11:18, the wicked worketh a deceitful work, but him that soweth righteousness shall be a sure reward. I mean, there's so many of these different quotes in the Bible that talk about reward, reward, reward. And it's not as though God's going to take someone who blatantly disregarded the Word of God, blatantly said, I don't have time for this, did not take interest, you don't care, and say, it's okay. Hey, listen, you just get a little smaller reward. It's not the way it works. Imagine being exposed to the greatest, and fill in the blanks of whatever it is for you in your brain. The greatest could be the greatest whatever. And standing back from it and saying, no big deal, and going the other way. That any other thing would have little or no impact on your future. But this amazing wonder that has happened to people who now suddenly wake up and say, I'm interested, I want to know about God, and then don't take their stewardship seriously. I'm going to ask you this question, which is, it'll be very searching, and it's rhetorical. Don't answer it aloud, just think about it. What do you think God will do with the man or woman who basically in their lifetime didn't care to even take account, pay attention, look into, investigate, want to know, but then now you're either dying or you're dead. Now you want to talk. Now you want. And the Bible says we must all stand and give account. We will give account of our stewardship. That stewardship is, I'm going to use them in kind of verbal pegs. The first one would be money, because that's the thing we're most accustomed to. Now let's go back before we were dealing with currency. In an agrarian society, it would have been your things, the tangible things, your animals, your food, the things that you've accumulated. But here, and we go into the New Testament, you find Paul saying on the first day of the week, let him or anyone lay aside what God has prospered. There is your stewardship. So we've got money. We've got stewardship as in your use of time. Now, I'm laying all this out here because this is no different than many of the things I've said over 15 years or much of the teaching that you've heard for 40 years from this ministry. It's really important to understand stewardship translates into your time, which is why Paul said, redeeming the time. Why? Because the days are evil. What does that mean, to redeem the time? It means to make good use of it. Now, I'm not going to come into your home and tell you, you're wasting time doing stupid things and mindless things. Sometimes, I've said this before, especially for those people who spend most of their time in labors of whatever you want to describe. It's good to have time where I've called it mindless time. Mindless time can be time to sit down and read a book, not the good book, a book, watch a movie. Everybody needs that, if you want to call it mindless entertainment or a distraction, a diversion, but that's not your whole day. That can't be your whole day. Can you think about what it would be like if every day you had an opportunity to change somebody's life in the most subtle ways, not in the, what do they call that? There used to be a program, Hidden Millionaires, where they come out and they change people's lives by taking some poor person, surprising them, and making them into a millionaire. Not like that. But imagine if you could change and influence people's lives every day. One of my closest friends, who I'm going to say is a believer in her own way, and I love and respect her desire, still hunger that's there, but not quite opened up to discipline, to learn. But something as simple as a quote that I shared Now it's being attributed to me, but I did say it was attributed to a very wise person that said, don't doubt in the dark what God showed you in the light. That's now hanging on somebody's wall because they took that word and reflected on it and said, yeah, I see what my life has become. I'm just looking at the darkness instead of remembering what I know to be true. Something so small that changed somebody's life in literally 30 seconds or less. Because now somebody's looking at that statement, which could be a reminder for that person to start exercising faith instead of looking at the things that bring fear and confusion. Do you understand what I'm saying when I say you can do that? You can actually influence people without being a chapter and verse. I'm going to beat you over the head with the Bible until you're really ready. No. But you can change and influence people's lives just like that. And I could go on and give a whole host of illustrations and examples, but I think they're not needed. You yourself know. Not everybody has good oratory skills, but everybody that has a mouth, that has the ability to speak and to communicate. Maybe you don't. Maybe you only can sign language. You can still offer someone encouragement in these very uncertain and discouraging times. So when I say stewardship of time, that's right in there. Stewardship of time isn't just I volunteer, I work for the Lord, I'm working in the ministry. Stewardship of your time can be something as simple and difficult as either teaching your children in the home or simply being a parent to your children with understanding that even that is part of your stewardship. Not just because you had a child, therefore you got to take care of them. That's part of your stewardship. The gift of life that God gave you, it's now your responsibility until that child is old enough legally to be on its own to take care of it. That's your stewardship. I could keep going on this. To your husband or your wife, there's another stewardship. Especially to those people who are wrestling with their marriage commitments. Their stewardship for you. I'm not condemning people who have failed marriages. Things in life happen. But that's still part of a stewardship. It's still part of a commitment that you made before God. So all of these things become stewardship. Money, time, and I can keep going down the list, but I'm trying to say to you, these are the things we will give account. The other thing I think I mentioned at the beginning, this judgment is universal. It means all believers without exception. So it's important to treat the knowledge you receive in the now as stewardship. It's important. It matters. It's going to matter. In comparison to people at different stages, say, take a person like the Apostle Paul. I imagine, if you think about it, for hundreds of years, people have read the writing of the Apostle Paul. And here's a man who, while he was alive, they sought to kill him. They had to let him over a balcony in a basket. He had to be smuggled around. He was imprisoned. He was rejected. He was treated really bad by people that should have been saying, wow, thanks, Paul. Thanks for making the difficult trek, and thanks for coming here, and thanks for encouraging us. Instead, he says, all Asia's forsaken me. Only Luke is with me. What type of rewards do you think that man is going to receive? To me, it's unimaginable. But I would never dare to put myself looking at my, and I call it that. This is not false humility. It's a paltry commitment when I juxtapose the Apostle Paul. But God is saying, I'm not to look on other people. I'm to look at myself. This is the problem of when we start to judge other people. We invest a lot of time in looking at, in nitpicking, and deciding, and criticizing. But the reality is God says, you better work on yourself first. Because when I come around and I judge you, my judgment towards your understanding of what I liked or disliked or what I expected of you is going to come into question. It's a very somber wake-up call for people that think the church is nothing but an amusement park or a place to park your kids when you don't feel like watching them. Okay? So the reason why I'm doing this in this very serious way is this is a serious subject. And there's no way to get people to understand. I really want to make sure that I'm making myself clear. So we've talked about the different bullet points here. And then what exactly is this judgment seat? So from the Greek, the word is bema. And bema was not so much a throne, if you will, but a platform, a raised platform, where if you go to the Olympics in antiquity, you would find their judge, referee, umpire, whoever was judging the sports, would be on this bema and essentially would declare who is the winner. And those winners, those in whatever field, whatever place, would step up in close proximity to the bema to receive their crown. And so it's important that we also understand Paul uses all these really brilliant analogies. For example, I didn't touch on this last week, but when he talks about if this tent is dissolved, we have treasure in earthen vessels. So brilliant because Paul by trade was a tent maker. So of course it's brilliant to talk about being tabernacled, all the tent analogies and pictorial words that are carried into his writings that give us vivid, clear understanding in picture words, if you will. So equally, he did the same thing with when a soldier goes to war, he doesn't entangle himself, or when he talks about, I fought the good fight of faith, there is henceforth laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Each one of these, we can say what we are going to be disclosing, or what will be opened up, or what will be made where we are giving our account, will also be met with, as I mentioned, the word rewards. And we shouldn't be doing things in this life like a carrot that's put in front of us. So you chase after the carrot to get the reward there. The motivation there is no longer doing it for Christ's sake, but doing it for a reward. But if we understand many times over, there are different places in the Bible where we're told about certain different crowns. For example, James, as much as I don't like quoting James 1:12 and Revelation 2:10 talk about for those people who will essentially overcome, there is a crown of life laid up for them that essentially will be part of their reward. For others, it's a crown of righteousness. For others, it's a crown of glory. There are actually 5 different mentions in the Bible of different types of crowns being given out, whether they are different or whether they are foci of the same. One cannot say. I cannot say for sure. But I can tell you this. There's much proof, if you keep reading through all of the books. Why does John write, to him that overcomes? To him that overcomes, this is what he will get. To him who overcomes, this is what he will get. So there is a sense that within this reward is also the understanding of what is expected of us. For example, we talk about temptation. These are all difficult. And they're difficult because they're all things we each, every single one of us. And you are a liar and deceive yourself if you say you don't wrestle with this. It's human nature. That's your Adam nature. That's my Adam nature to deal with this. Temptation. And temptation is not just about sex, friends. Temptation can be temptation to alcohol. It could be temptation for food. It could be temptation to lie. It could be. There's 1,000 areas of temptation. God knows our frame, which is why the Scripture says there is no temptation known to man or such as common to man, that God essentially didn't provide the way of escape for that circumstance. He's given you the fire exit if you'll use it. Most of us don't. So we succumb. Now, as I said, God knows our frame, and I'm not saying because we sin and we have grace, we should sin all the more. That's not what's being said. It's the age-old problem that Paul cried out O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? I want to do certain things, but I find myself not doing certain things. And the things I don't want to do, I find myself doing. This is what Paul said. Quite a conundrum, but guess what? It's the human conundrum. We all grapple with it in one way or one dimension or another. Having this knowledge, and this is an important point, having this knowledge of what I just said is like having the awareness that we will all grapple with something. We will all wrestle. Some of us will give way. Some of us will overcome. God doesn't say because you succumb to temptation, because you gave way, somehow God says, well, you're a loser and I'm done with you. He knows our frame. He knows between his knowledge of us and the devil's knowledge of our weakness. There's a good battle for the soul, which I've said, this is what the church is about. It is a battle for your soul. And most people don't see it like that. They just see it as, it's church, it's Sunday. I'd rather be home watching reruns of an old, boring, grainy football game than displace my great self and listen for something that actually might put my life on a different course and spare me from the uncertainties that if you're not sure, I can't be sure for you. My faith can't do it for you. My faith is for me. My faith works for me. Your faith works for you. You have to faith and do the work of trusting God yourself. I can't do that for you. So, back to the rewards then. Let's talk about these a little bit, because this is, as I said, it's another one of these in a dimension in my series, which is important. Why? Because it proves to you something. These rewards will be handed out, and there's a great debate among scholars. Some people say it will be after the rapture. Some people say it will be before the millennium. Some people say it will be after the millennium. It doesn't matter. For the purpose of what I'm saying, it doesn't matter for one reason. It matters that it eventually will happen. That's the most important thing I can tell you today. Not, people get hung up on, well, it'll happen here, it'll happen there. No, it'll happen eventually, which means you will be resurrected from wherever you came from, which is most likely the grave or a crypt, to stand and give account, which is why I keep talking about this, the importance of us understanding life does not end like the morticians would like to tell you, let's all just sit down and cry because it's all over. There's something else to be looked at which will last infinitely longer than the time I've had here on earth or the time you've had here on earth. So it's almost like, maybe I should look into this thing, because if you're telling me something else is going to happen over there, it means I have to be awake and out of the grave. And no, I'm not being condemned to hell at this judgment seat of Christ, which means, I'm going to say it in a very colloquial way, I'm in, but the degree of whatever I receive from God, that's what's going to come into question. Now, somebody might say, hey, listen, all I care about is making it into the right place. Okay. That's almost like the most shallow thought process that one could have concerning the things of God. Now, if you go back and you start taking the time to read about these different places where God talks about rewards, specifically in the New Testament, there's enough information when you start putting those pieces together to realize that God has been repeatedly, through His Spirit, in this book, trying to warn us that everything we do matters. And maybe one day, maybe today, or maybe let's take yesterday, maybe today I wasted a whole bunch of time, I didn't really make good use of the day, and I come back to God and I talk to God about it. God, I really didn't make good use of my day, kind of squandered it. Sorry. And I want to do better. Doesn't mean that I will, but I'm at least talking to God about it, acknowledging that I've squandered something. This is what the parables of Jesus talk about. And this is why I ask myself, why do people study the parables if they don't think that there is going to be an application at the end? Why even study any of this. When Jesus talks about the parable of the sower and then says, ultimately, there's these different types of soil, and one that's actually going to yield one out of four is going to yield fruit, some 30, some 60, and in some cases, one of the versions 90 or 100-fold, which says some people will be incredibly fruitful to God, other people a little less, and other people not so much. So I want to make sure that we all understand this is not the place where sin is being judged. It's not the place where God says, okay, that door for hell and that door for heaven. That judgment seat is the place of basically giving an account, an assessment of what you did with what you received from Him since you believed in your lifetime. So what should we take away from this? And what should we really be looking at and trying to figure out? Well, the first thing I want you to know is that probably everybody in the sound of my voice, including me, has messed this up pretty bad. Does that make you feel better? I see a lot of people look a lot less shocked in front of me. We all messed it up. There isn't somebody who's done it perfectly and you're just a mess up. We've all messed it up. It's almost like if people can take this message and say, I need to really think about this. I need to understand a little bit more. And maybe do a little bit more digging to understand what God expects of me when it says we must all stand and give account. He did not expect me to work miracles. I mean, if He gave me that gift, I'm sure I would. He didn't give me things and say, I want you to go and do something that's so impossible. But the things that He gave me are very simple. And the first one begins with the gift of faith. That gift of faith which can keep growing as long as I stay in the Word, to try and better understand and better come to know Him. So why wouldn't we take the time? And why wouldn't we, in the now, start reflecting on this? That's not to say, and I don't want anybody misinterpreting what I've said here in the last hour. That is not to say that somehow, if you want to go out and enjoy a leisurely walk, that God's going to frown on you and say, well, that was a waste of time. Or you want to kick up your feet and watch TV. There are some people in the olden days that would say, oh, you can't do that. That's a sin. That's a sin. That's a sin. Everything was a sin. No, there's something called balance. And the balance that we have for the believer. You put God first, He takes care of the rest. And God is wanting your heart to be towards Him. But I'd say this, God is also, knowing our frame, knows, and especially in this day and age, how distracted are we with 1,000 different avenues to be distracted, whether it's on social media, whether it's the TV, whatever it is we choose. The distractions are abundant. Now, I'm not saying that any of those are bad. I'm simply saying it's the balance that standing before Him and giving an account, it won't be this narcissistic, self-serving, self-pride, ego-driven, I did whatever I did because I did it, because that's not going to fly with Him. But rather, I know that I probably didn't exercise my stewardship. This is me talking, as good as I could have. And the question that I would have you ask yourself, it's one just to ponder, to reflect on. You know, evangelists would have a field day with this. You know, their famous question is, if you died today, you know, what they tend to do and guilt you into something. I'm asking you to just sit down later today or sometime this week and be honest with yourself. You don't have to talk to anybody else about it except yourself. And if you're really honest with yourself, you'll come to the same conclusion that most people will come to. I haven't done that good of a job. And you know what? I'm sure that I could do better, but right now the thing that I need the most from the Lord is guidance and direction from His Word to help me stay focused. And I'm not calling this works or productivity for the Lord. I'm talking about this as stewardship and commitment. Now, you know those folks that like to talk about, I told you I'd come back to money. You know those folks that like to talk about, and I hear them all the time, say, well, you know, I listen to so-and-so, but, you know, the problem is they're always talking about money, and they want money, and they're always asking for money. You have a problem that you may need to overcome, which is God is not interested and wait for it. Wait for me to finish the whole thing. God's not really interested in your money. God's interested in getting you 100%. He has you 100%. You exercise your stewardship over the money that He's let you have. See, everybody has this wrong. Well, are you focused on this? No. God's focused on something more important. But the behavior of the things that we deal with in our culture and society reflect. Spurgeon was the one that said, look at a man or a woman's checkbook, and I'll tell you where they're at. People who are essentially, and his intent was to say people who are not generous, who are stingy, who are cheap. And trust me, there are a lot of people out there in the world that think that will fly before God, that they somehow will brand that in a positive way as being frugal. But to the one who gave everything, do you really think that's going to fly? Or I've seen this many times, and I like this analogy because it really does show you how we miss the mark so badly on this. Have you ever been to a great party, a great dinner? You know, you're on your way there and you think, it'll be some, that cold chicken type, the stuff, it's like fake chicken that they serve you. And you get there, you're not only seated at a special table as a guest of honor, but what you're served is the finest meat, the finest fare, the finest of everything. You didn't expect that, but that's what you were served. And instead of going to see the host or the hostess and expressing incredible gratitude for what you've received, whatever it is, you just get up and you leave. That's how most people treat God. Lack of gratitude, lack of respect, lack of understanding at the cost. That's right, I said the cost. When the Bible says He sent His only begotten Son, He gave His life, laid down His life, that you and I might have life and more abundantly. Failure to acknowledge the cost makes some versions of Christianity nothing but cheap imitations of what God intended. And I've said to you before, if that doesn't sink home with you, God's not looking for imitation of anything. He's looking for the real, genuine article of faith. That is all that He wants. And when that faith comes, desire to grab hold, to understand, to draw closer, to get to know Him, the one you will spend eternity with, then it changes the whole mindset. And I'm hoping today, as somber and as serious as this is, that people will hear what I'm saying and say, you're right. Now, I started with me. So I'm not somewhere standing on a soapbox looking down at you all. I'm looking at me first. And if I'm able to say this, and as I said, not false humility, but a reality, I could have done much more. I could have done better. That's not me willing to do works. That's me willing to please Him. What does the Bible say? Without faith, it's impossible to please God. There's my starting point. So I'm going to start there, and I'm going to ask for increased faith and increased understanding in the things concerning Him, that when I do stand, because I will and so will you, the account that I give, albeit maybe a little bit faulty, maybe not the thing that I imagined, but minimally with understanding and with respect and with the awareness that unlike an earthly judge or any earthly person that can be deceived, why does Paul say in the end of Galatians, be not deceived, God is not to be mocked and will not be mocked, for whatever a man sows, that's what he's going to reap. Go back and reread some of those passages you're familiar with the eyes of the judgment seat of Christ, and recognize that we who get complacent are probably the worst. The people who have just come to the faith, who are still kind of that rosy newness and excitement and desiring, they're still on the pathway to looking at, what can I do to please Him? Some of us have been walking the walk of faith for a long time and are maybe a little bit tired, a little bit complacent. Some of us may be a little bit bored. So I'm saying to you today, it's a good day to take a fresh look. It's a good day to revisit some of these concepts And it's a good day to understand that God is not some cruel killjoy that says, don't ever have fun, don't ever have a moment for yourself. But whatever you do all things unto the Lord. And when you come to that mindset, you do indeed have the mind of Christ, which is the mindset standing before Him, full of faith, imperfectly, being able to give account. And it will be not perfect, but it will be with the intent and desire that wanted to please Him, as He is the only audience you and I need to be concerned with, not your brother or your sister and the ones that are busy doing all the inspecting and all the criticism. God will take care of them too. But right now, I'm asking you to take some time and reflect on what I've said, and hopefully you won't leave this message today going, okay, that's another Sunday in the books. Next, because this one does require reflection and meditation on what I've said, because it's pretty heavy. And if it's not heavy to you, it means nothing I've said has had any impact. And that's something that you should be concerned with. I am, if there's no impact. I am, because this concerns me in what I've said to you. So, when it says we must all stand, we will, and hopefully we will do so, full of faith, having trusted and having made it all the way there, knowing, as I said, not perfect, but Lord, this is my stewardship. I'm ready to give account. Whenever you are, I'm ready. Now, take this message today and please digest it, because it is important for every believer. And it's important for me as a pastor to say, I put this out there, as hard and as difficult as it is, and maybe even for some people, unpleasant and scary. I did my part in putting it out there. I'm not done about talking about this, because this and the other side of this, which is the white throne judgment, which also will need to talk about the wrath of God and the punishment that will be poured out on the earth, not on the church and not the believers, but we'll talk about that too. But right now, that's my message. I pray, and I earnestly pray this, that you will take what I've said today and reflect on it. Don't make this, as I said, another message and just move on. This is one that should affect your entire being and the rest of your life. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.